Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The most powerful goodbye is the one spoken without raising your voice. On a quiet Saturday morning in the rolling countryside just outside Asheville, North Carolina, the Mercer family garden looked exactly the way Evelyn Mercer had always loved it. Rows of white hydrangeas swayed gently beneath the early summer breeze. Lavender lined the narrow stone path leading toward the old farmhouse. The air smelled of fresh earth, cut grass, and roses that had bloomed weeks earlier than expected. It should have been the happiest day of her life. White chairs were arranged beneath a large oak tree. Satin ribbons fluttered softly from every aisle. A string quartet rehearsed in the distance while neighbors whispered excitedly behind glasses of sweet tea. Everyone believed they had gathered to celebrate an engagement that would lead to a perfect wedding. Everyone except the bride-to-be. Evelyn stood alone behind the farmhouse, staring at the tiny vegetable garden her late father had built with his own hands almost 15 years ago. She slowly ran her fingers across the weathered wooden fence, remembering the countless mornings he had taught her that beautiful things only survived when someone cared enough to nurture them every single day. He had never talked much about success. He only believed that character was the richest soil any dream could grow from. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "They're waiting." Her mother smiled nervously from the back porch, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. Evelyn returned a gentle smile that never reached her eyes. "I know." Inside the decorated garden, guests applauded as Brandon Holloway adjusted his expensive navy suit and flashed the confident grin everyone expected from the future owner of Holloway Luxury Communities. He looked successful, handsome, polished, the perfect son-in-law according to nearly everyone present. Nearly everyone. Brandon noticed Evelyn approaching and reached for her hand before she even reached him. "There she is," he laughed. "Thought you were getting cold feet." She looked into his eyes for a long moment. Strange how someone could stand inches away, yet feel like a complete stranger. The officiant cleared his throat with an encouraging smile. "Shall we begin?" Evelyn glanced around the garden one last time. She saw hopeful faces, curious smiles, phones already raised to capture the perfect moment. She even saw Brandon's parents exchanging satisfied looks, already celebrating the business connections this marriage would secure. Nobody noticed that Evelyn wasn't trembling from nerves. She was simply deciding whether courage sounded quieter than fear. Brandon lifted the velvet box and slowly opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring that caught the morning sunlight. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. "Evelyn Mercer," Brandon announced confidently. "You've always known we belong together. Let's make it official." Silence answered him. Evelyn looked down at the ring, then back toward the old vegetable garden beyond the guests. Her father's words echoed inside her heart. Beautiful things only survive when someone truly cares. She gently reached forward, not to accept the ring, but to close the velvet box with calm, steady fingers. The faint click sounded impossibly loud. Brandon blinked. "What are you doing?" Evelyn carefully removed the simple promise ring she had been wearing for months and placed it inside his hand. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, only quiet certainty. "I'm ending this," she said softly. "You deserve someone who wants the same life you do." Brandon laughed awkwardly, expecting a joke. "Come on, Evelyn." She slowly shook her head. "This isn't the life I want." Murmurs spread across the garden. Her mother covered her mouth. Brandon's father frowned in disbelief while his mother whispered something sharp beneath her breath. Brandon stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're embarrassing both families." Evelyn met his stare without flinching. "No, I'm finally being honest with both families." For several long seconds, nobody moved. Even the quartet had stopped playing. Somewhere beyond the property line, a deep, mechanical sound rolled across the hills. At first it resembled distant thunder. Then it grew louder. Guests turned toward the sky together. Birds burst from the oak trees as powerful rotor blades sliced through the peaceful morning air. Brandon looked upward, confused. Children from neighboring farms pointed excitedly from across the road. Dust swirled through the flower beds as an enormous black helicopter descended lower and lower, casting a sweeping shadow across the Mercer family's garden. Every conversation stopped. Every phone lifted toward the impossible sight. The aircraft settled gently on the wide, open lawn beyond the hydrangeas, only yards from the old vegetable garden Evelyn's father had built years before. The rotors continued spinning as the cabin door slowly opened. A tall man stepped onto the grass wearing a charcoal suit despite the summer heat. Calm, composed, unhurried. He carried only a weathered leather envelope tucked beneath one arm. His eyes never wandered toward the stunned crowd. They settled directly on Evelyn, as though he had crossed the country for one reason alone. Then, with the helicopter still humming behind him, the stranger smiled politely and spoke the words that would change every life standing in that garden forever. "Miss Mercer, I'm afraid I'm a few minutes late." Nobody spoke for what felt like an entire minute. The steady hum of the helicopter blades filled the silence that had settled over the Mercer family garden, scattering flower petals across the freshly cut lawn. Evelyn stood exactly where she had ended her engagement, unable to recognize the man walking toward her with measured confidence. He looked to be in his mid-30s, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, yet there was nothing flashy about him. His expression carried neither arrogance nor urgency. It was calm, almost respectful, as if interrupting an engagement party with a helicopter happened far less often than arriving late to a business meeting. Brandon finally stepped forward, forcing an uneasy smile. "I think you have the wrong address." The stranger barely glanced at him. Instead, he stopped several feet in front of Evelyn and inclined his head. Politely, "Miss Evelyn Mercer?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. My name is Callan Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Evelyn, but the reaction around her was immediate. One of Brandon's business partners nearly dropped his coffee. Another guest whispered so loudly that everyone nearby could hear. "Whitmore?" As in Whitmore Dynamics. Brandon's father suddenly straightened his posture, his confident expression replaced by disbelief. "The Callan Whitmore?" Callan answered with a courteous smile. "Yes, sir." A stunned silence followed. Even Brandon seemed to recognize the name now. Whitmore Dynamics had become one of the largest sustainable infrastructure companies in the country. Its projects stretched from California to Maine, and financial magazines regularly placed Callan among the youngest self-made billionaires in America. Yet none of that explained why he had landed in Evelyn's family garden only moments after she had quietly ended her engagement. Callan turned back toward Evelyn and carefully lifted the weathered leather envelope he had been carrying. Unlike his immaculate appearance, the envelope looked decades old. Its edges were worn smooth. The leather had faded from dark brown to soft chestnut, and the brass clasp showed tiny scratches earned through years of careful handling. "I have been trying to find you for almost 3 months, he said. Evelyn frowned. "Me? Yes." He offered the envelope with both hands. "This belongs to your family." She hesitated before accepting it. The leather felt unexpectedly warm from the morning sun. Embossed in one corner were 2 initials that had nearly disappeared with age. TM. Her heartbeat quickened. Those initials belonged to her father, Thomas Mercer. She carefully opened the clasp and discovered 3 items inside. The first was an old black and white photograph of 2 young men standing beside a pickup truck covered in construction dust. One of them was unmistakably her father in his 20s, smiling with the same gentle eyes she remembered. The second was a folded letter written in faded blue ink. The third was a small brass key attached to a simple leather cord. Evelyn stared at the photograph, confused. "Where did you get this?" "From my father," Callan answered quietly. "He kept it with him until the day he passed away." Evelyn looked up, searching his face for answers. "Your father knew mine?" Callan nodded once. They were far more than acquaintances. Brandon stepped between them, impatience replacing his earlier confusion. "Excuse me, but whatever this is, it can wait. We were in the middle of something important." Callan finally looked directly at him. His expression remained perfectly calm. "Actually, Mr. Holloway, I believe what just happened is exactly why I needed to arrive today." Brandon folded his arms. "And why is that?" Callan answered without raising his voice. "Because this envelope was never meant to be delivered to a married woman." Murmurs swept through the guests once again. Brandon's mother looked horrified while his father exchanged nervous glances with several investors standing nearby. Evelyn barely heard any of them. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was immediately familiar. Every birthday card, every note left beside her lunchbox before school, every grocery list her father had scribbled across the kitchen counter. She would have recognized those careful letters anywhere. Her vision blurred as she quietly read the first line. If you are reading this, then someone has finally kept a promise that took far longer than either of us expected. A tear escaped before she could stop it. She quickly brushed it away, embarrassed by the crowd watching her. Callan spoke gently. Your father saved my father's company 22 years ago. Evelyn looked up in surprise. My dad never owned a company. No, Callan replied with a faint smile. He saved something far more valuable than a company. He glanced toward the old vegetable garden where Thomas Mercer had spent countless evenings working beside his daughter. He saved a man's integrity when everyone else had given up on him. My father never forgot that. Evelyn looked back at the letter, then at the small brass key resting in her palm. None of it made sense yet. Why had her father hidden this entire chapter of his life? Why had Callan waited until today? And why? Did she suddenly feel as though ending her engagement had not closed one chapter of her life at all, but quietly unlocked another that had been waiting for her all along? The guests slowly drifted away in stunned silence, their conversations fading into the distance like echoes carried by the mountain breeze. Brandon left without another word after realizing nothing he could say would erase what had already happened. His parents followed, offering stiff smiles that fooled no one. Within half an hour, the elegant celebration had disappeared, leaving behind empty white chairs, forgotten flower petals, and unanswered questions scattered across the Mercer family garden. Evelyn remained beneath the old oak tree with the letter folded carefully inside the weathered envelope. Her mother stood quietly beside her, still trying to understand how an ordinary engagement morning had transformed into something neither of them could explain. Callan respected the silence before speaking again. There is more your father wanted you to know. Evelyn looked toward him. Then tell me. Instead of answering immediately, he glanced at the vegetable garden where neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs stretched beneath the morning sun. May we walk? She nodded. They crossed the yard together while her mother remained on the porch, watching them with cautious curiosity. Callan stopped beside the small wooden gate Thomas Mercer had built years earlier. My father, Richard Whitmore, started with almost nothing. 22 years ago, his construction company was on the verge of bankruptcy after a dishonest business partner abandoned him with enormous debt. Banks refused to help. Investors disappeared overnight. Everyone told him to declare failure. Evelyn listened quietly. Your father met mine then? Yes. Callan smiled faintly. Your father was the lead landscape supervisor on one of his projects. He could have walked away like everyone else. Instead, he stayed. He convinced dozens of workers to finish the project even though nobody knew whether they would ever be paid. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the soil beneath her boots. That sounded exactly like the man who had raised her. Eventually, the project succeeded. Callan continued. My father rebuilt his company from that single opportunity. Years later, it became Whitmore Dynamics. He paused before adding softly, every success our family enjoys today traces back to one man who chose integrity instead of convenience. Evelyn swallowed hard. He never told me any of this. Because he never believed kindness should become a transaction. She smiled sadly. That sounds like him. Callan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a slim navy folder. Unlike the old envelope, this one looked new and unmistakably corporate. He handed it to Evelyn. This part is from me. She opened it carefully. The first page displayed architectural renderings of rolling hills, walking trails, botanical gardens, outdoor classrooms, and restored wetlands covering hundreds of acres. The title across the top read Mercer Valley Restoration Initiative. Evelyn stared at the plans in disbelief. This is impossible. No, Callan replied. It is unfinished. She flipped through page after page of detailed landscape concepts, native plant lists, community gardens, wildlife habitats, and educational spaces. Every page reflected the same philosophy her father had taught her since childhood. Build something that gives more than it takes. Who designed this? She whispered. Nobody. Then why does it feel like? Because it was inspired by journals your father shared with mine many years ago. Evelyn slowly closed the folder. Why are you showing me this? Callan met her eyes with complete honesty. Because I cannot finish it without you. She blinked. I am a small-town landscape designer. There are thousands of professionals more qualified. There are thousands with better resumes. He smiled gently. There is only one Evelyn Mercer. She laughed nervously. You barely know me. I know enough. He looked around the peaceful property before continuing. You ended an engagement that offered wealth, security, and status because your heart knew it was the wrong life. That decision tells me far more about your character than any portfolio ever could. Evelyn felt unexpectedly vulnerable. Nobody had described her decision that way. Everyone else had called it reckless. There is one condition, Callan said carefully. Her shoulders stiffened. I thought there might be. The project is facing intense political and financial pressure. Several investors believe it needs a public face. They also believe stability matters. He hesitated for the first time since arriving. The board has been pushing me toward an engagement that would strengthen certain business relationships. Evelyn's expression changed immediately. You are not asking what I think you are asking. Perhaps I am. He took a slow breath. I need someone the public can believe in. Someone honest enough to stand beside me without pretending to be impressed by my money. She stared at him in complete disbelief. You want me to become your fiancé? Temporarily. He spoke with calm precision. 6 months. A public engagement only. Separate homes. Complete respect for your independence. No expectation beyond mutual trust. At the end of 6 months, we quietly end the arrangement. And regardless of what happens afterward, Mercer Valley becomes yours to lead exactly as your father once dreamed. Evelyn looked from the navy folder to the old leather envelope in her hands. One represented the future. The other carried the past. Somewhere between them stood a man she had met less than an hour ago, asking her to step into a life she had never imagined. Before she could answer, a small velvet box appeared in Callan's open hand. Inside rested a remarkable sapphire ring surrounded by delicate diamonds, elegant without being extravagant. This belonged to my mother, he said quietly. It has never been offered to anyone else. Evelyn did not reach for it. She simply stood beneath the summer sky, realizing that only a few hours after ending one engagement, fate had placed another impossible choice directly in front of her. Evelyn barely slept that night. Long after her mother had turned off the porch light and the farmhouse had fallen silent, she sat alone at the old kitchen table with her father's letter spread carefully beside the navy proposal folder. Every few minutes her eyes drifted from the faded handwriting to the detailed drawings of Mercer Valley Restoration Initiative. They felt strangely connected, as though one had planted a seed decades ago, and the other had arrived carrying its first green shoot. Shortly before sunrise, she walked into the garden wearing jeans, work boots, and an oversized denim shirt. Dew clung to every blade of grass as she knelt beside the vegetable beds her father had once tended with patient hands. She remembered something he often said whenever a storm damaged his plants. You cannot control the weather, Evelyn. You can only decide whether you plant again tomorrow. She smiled quietly to herself. By 8 o'clock that morning, the distant sound of rotor blades returned, but this time the helicopter landed in an open pasture beyond the property to avoid disturbing the flowers. Callan stepped out carrying nothing except a travel mug of coffee. He looked less like a billionaire and more like someone arriving for an early meeting with an old friend. Evelyn met him at the garden gate before he could reach the porch. I have an answer, she said. Callan nodded patiently. I am listening. She looked directly into his eyes. I will help with the project. Relief flickered across his face before she continued. But not because of the money. Not because of the land. I am doing it because my father believed unfinished promises deserve to be completed. That is exactly why I asked you. She folded her arms. I also have conditions. A small smile appeared on his face. Good. I was hoping you would. First, no one tells me how to design Mercer Valley. Second, I keep living here whenever I am not required elsewhere. Third, if I think this arrangement starts hurting innocent people, I walk away immediately. Callan extended his hand without hesitation. Agreed. She looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. And one more thing, she added. Do not expect me to become someone I am not. Miss Mercer, he replied warmly. The entire purpose of this arrangement is that you never pretend to be anyone else. 2 days later, Evelyn found herself standing inside Whitmore Dynamics headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina. The glass tower stretched nearly 50 stories above the city skyline, its polished lobby reflecting sunlight across marble floors that looked too perfect to walk on. Employees hurried confidently between meetings while digital displays showcased projects worth billions of dollars. Evelyn instinctively glanced down at her dusty leather boots. She had cleaned them twice before leaving home, but they still carried faint traces of red Carolina soil. A young assistant approached with an enthusiastic smile. "Miss Mercer? Welcome. Mr. Whitmore is waiting upstairs." The private elevator climbed silently toward the executive floor. When the doors opened, Evelyn discovered an office unlike anything she had imagined. There were no gold decorations or oversized portraits. Instead, enormous windows overlooked the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, and shelves overflowed with books about architecture, engineering, conservation, and history. Callan stood near one window reviewing construction reports before looking up with an easy smile. "I was beginning to think the elevator had scared you away." "It almost did," she admitted. He laughed softly. "That makes two of us. I still prefer taking the stairs." She raised an eyebrow. 48 flights. Only when I need to think." Before she could answer, the conference room doors opened and nearly 20 executives entered carrying tablets and laptops. Their conversations stopped the instant they noticed Evelyn. Curious eyes swept across her simple clothes, practical boots, and loose ponytail. One executive offered a polite smile. Others looked openly skeptical. An older board member leaned toward another and whispered something that made both men glance at her again. Callan ignored every reaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said confidently, "I would like you to meet Evelyn Mercer. She will be serving as lead consultant for Mercer Valley Restoration and, effective today, she is also my fiancée." The room froze. Several executives exchanged startled looks while cameras from the company's communications department immediately lowered in surprise. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat despite knowing this announcement had been planned. The sapphire ring rested comfortably on her finger now, elegant yet unexpectedly light. It still felt unfamiliar every time she noticed it catching the light. Before anyone could recover, another executive hurried into the room, carrying revised presentation boards. As he set them beside the conference table, one large landscape rendering accidentally slipped free and spread across the polished floor. Without thinking, everyone stepped back except Evelyn. She immediately knelt, studying the design with practiced eyes. After only a few seconds, she looked up. "Who approved this drainage layout?" The room fell silent again. "If this is built exactly as drawn, the first major storm will wash half the hillside into the creek. You are planting beauty where the water wants to move." Nature always wins that argument. Every conversation in the conference room came to an immediate stop. The engineering team looked from Evelyn to the landscape drawing and back again, uncertain whether to dismiss her observation or take it seriously. One of the senior architects adjusted his glasses before speaking carefully. "Our environmental consultants approved that drainage model 3 months ago." Evelyn remained kneeling beside the blueprint. She traced the contour lines with one finger, following the natural slope of the hillside until she reached a narrow creek that curved through the property. "On paper, maybe," she answered calmly. "But the land is telling a different story." She looked toward the large satellite image mounted on the presentation board. These contour lines were taken during late summer. The survey missed the winter runoff. When heavy rain comes through these hills, the water will cut across this section instead of following your retention basin. Within 2 years, this entire walking trail will begin sinking. A few executives exchanged doubtful glances, but Callan remained silent. He wanted everyone else to hear her before offering his opinion. The chief engineer leaned closer to study the drawing. After several moments, his confident expression slowly faded. "Zoom in on Sector 4, he instructed the technician. The digital display changed, revealing detailed topographic scans. The engineer frowned. "Run the winter flood simulation." Seconds later, blue lines spread across the screen exactly where Evelyn had predicted. Instead of flowing neatly into the designed basin, the virtual stormwater carved directly through the proposed botanical gardens before flooding nearly half the walking paths. The room became completely silent. One board member quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another executive whispered, "That redesign would have cost millions after construction." The chief engineer slowly looked toward Evelyn. "How did you see that so quickly?" She smiled modestly. "My father always told me that land speaks before people do. You just have to stop talking long enough to listen." Callan could not hide the quiet pride in his expression. He folded his arms and addressed the room. That is precisely why Miss Mercer is leading this project. Nobody argued. The atmosphere had shifted. Skepticism had not disappeared entirely, but respect had quietly entered the room. As the meeting continued, Evelyn surprised them again. Rather than recommending expensive structural changes, she proposed restoring native wetlands to absorb seasonal runoff naturally, replacing imported decorative plants with local species that required less maintenance, and creating educational walking trails where visitors could learn about conservation while supporting nearby farming communities. Every suggestion balanced environmental responsibility with financial practicality. When the meeting finally ended 2 hours later, several executives approached her individually with questions instead of criticism. Even the chief engineer asked whether she would review additional site plans before the next construction phase. As the conference room gradually emptied, Callan gathered the presentation folders while Evelyn stood near the window overlooking downtown Charlotte. "You handled that much better than I expected," he admitted. She laughed softly. "I was terrified. Nobody noticed. That is because I kept staring at contour maps instead of people." He smiled. "Perhaps that is your secret." Before either of them could continue, a confident female voice interrupted from the doorway. "Callan, I thought the rumors were exaggerated." Both turned toward the entrance. A sophisticated woman wearing an elegant cream business suit walked inside, carrying a designer handbag and the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to every room welcoming her arrival. Her dark blonde hair was perfectly styled, and several executives who had remained nearby immediately greeted her with familiar smiles. She looked at Evelyn with polite curiosity before returning her attention to Callan. "You really announced an engagement without telling me first." Callan's relaxed posture became noticeably more formal. "Vanessa." Evelyn sensed the subtle change immediately. Vanessa offered her hand with practiced grace. "Vanessa Ellington. Our families have known each other for years." Evelyn accepted the handshake. "It is nice to meet you." Vanessa's smile remained flawless, but her eyes lingered briefly on the sapphire ring. "That is an interesting choice. I have only seen it once before." Callan answered before Evelyn could respond. "It belonged to my mother." "Yes," Vanessa replied quietly. "I remember." For a brief moment, an awkward silence settled between them. Then Vanessa looked back toward Evelyn. "I hope you understand what kind of world you have stepped into. It can be less forgiving than a beautiful garden." Evelyn answered with the same calm honesty that had carried her through the morning. "Gardens teach patience. They also teach that weeds grow fastest where nobody pays attention." Vanessa studied her for several seconds before giving a small, unreadable smile. "That is an unexpectedly thoughtful answer." She turned to Callan. "The foundation gala is Friday evening. Every major investor will be there." Her gaze shifted once more to Evelyn. "I suppose everyone will finally have the opportunity to meet the woman who changed the future of Whitmore Dynamics in a single afternoon." After Vanessa walked away, Evelyn released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. "I have a feeling she does not like me very much." Callan watched the elevator doors close before answering honestly. "She does not know you yet." Evelyn looked down at the sapphire ring, catching the afternoon sunlight. Somehow, the simple agreement they had made beneath her father's oak tree already felt far more complicated than either of them had imagined, and deep inside the polished halls of Whitmore Dynamics, she sensed that the real test had not begun in the boardroom. It would begin the moment the entire world started watching. Friday evening arrived wrapped in golden sunset light that reflected across the glass towers of downtown Charlotte. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala occupied the grand ballroom of the historic Ashcroft Hotel, where crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests representing business leaders, philanthropists, elected officials, and national media. Luxury cars lined the entrance while photographers waited behind velvet ropes, eager to capture every important arrival. Inside one of the private preparation suites, Evelyn stood in front of a full-length mirror wearing a deep emerald evening gown chosen not by a celebrity stylist, but by herself after politely declining several expensive designer options. The dress was elegant without being extravagant, and around her finger rested the sapphire ring that still felt more like a promise to her father than a symbol of an engagement. She adjusted a loose strand of hair before taking a slow breath. The room behind her remained quiet until Callan knocked softly on the open door. "May I come in?" She smiled through her nervousness. "You own the building tonight." I suppose I cannot stop you. He laughed gently before stepping inside. For a brief moment, he simply looked at her without speaking. What? She asked. Nothing. He shook his head with an amused smile. I was expecting you to choose something the consultants recommended. Evelyn glanced down at the dress. They suggested diamonds, dramatic colors, and shoes that would probably send me to the emergency room before dessert. That earned a genuine laugh from him. You look exactly like yourself. She met his eyes. That was the plan. They walked toward the ballroom together. But just before the large doors opened, Callan slowed his pace. One reminder, he said quietly. Tonight, there will be difficult questions. Some people will assume you are here because of my last name. Evelyn answered without hesitation. Then I will spend the evening giving them a reason to remember mine. His smile lingered longer than usual. I believe you will. The ballroom felt noticeably quieter as they entered together. Camera flashes reflected against polished marble, while conversations paused long enough for curious glances to follow them across the room. Several reporters immediately began whispering into microphones. Guests studied Evelyn with the careful interest usually reserved for unexpected headlines. Some smiled warmly. Others looked openly skeptical. Vanessa Ellington watched from across the ballroom while speaking with several influential investors. She remained graceful as always, though her thoughtful expression revealed that she was carefully observing every interaction. Throughout the first hour, Evelyn discovered that high society operated much like any other community. Some people welcomed strangers. Others quietly measured them before offering kindness. She listened far more than she spoke, thanking volunteers, asking nonprofit directors about their community programs, and complimenting local scholarship recipients instead of discussing business headlines. Slowly, conversations became easier. Several guests stopped seeing the billionaire's fiancée and started seeing Evelyn Mercer. Later in the evening, the foundation announced a surprise presentation honoring organizations seeking funding for environmental restoration projects. Representatives from across the Southeast displayed proposals before a review committee that included major donors and board members. During one presentation, a respected consulting firm proudly introduced plans for restoring flood-damaged farmland outside Raleigh. Their digital renderings received enthusiastic applause until the moderator invited questions from the audience. Silence filled the ballroom. Then Evelyn quietly raised her hand. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. The presenter smiled politely. Yes, Miss Mercer? She stood slowly, speaking with the same calm confidence that had surprised Whitmore. Dynamics only days earlier. Your restoration plan is beautiful. But have you spoken with the families who still farm that land? The presenter hesitated. Our environmental analysis covered the region extensively. That was not my question. Her voice remained gentle. Have you sat at their kitchen tables? Have you asked where the water rises after 3 days of rain? Which fields flood first? Which oak trees survived because someone's grandfather planted them 100 years ago? The ballroom became remarkably still. Evelyn continued, never sounding critical, only sincere. Land is not healed by blueprints alone. It is healed by listening to the people who have loved it the longest. An elderly farmer seated near the back slowly rose to his feet. She is right, he said with quiet conviction. Nobody from that consulting team ever visited our community. Others began nodding in agreement. Members of the review committee exchanged thoughtful looks, while several donors immediately requested revisions before approving funding. Callan watched everything unfold without saying a single word. Pride warmed his expression in a way no successful business deal ever had. Evelyn had not embarrassed anyone. She had simply reminded an entire ballroom that expertise, without humility, often overlooked the most important voices. As applause gradually filled the room, one of the senior trustees approached the stage unexpectedly. He adjusted the microphone and smiled toward Evelyn. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, it appears we have just been given an important lesson tonight. The Whitmore Foundation was built on listening before leading. Miss Mercer, thank you for reminding us of that tradition. While the applause continued, Vanessa observed Callan from across the ballroom. She noticed something subtle that perhaps no one else recognized. He was no longer looking at Evelyn as someone fulfilling a carefully negotiated arrangement. Without realizing it himself, he was looking at her as though every carefully built wall around his heart had begun to crack, not because she had tried to impress him, but because she had quietly remained exactly who she had always been. The Headlines began appearing before sunrise the next morning. Every business website, entertainment channel, and local newspaper seemed to have the same photograph on its front page. Callan Whitmore stood beside Evelyn Mercer beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Foundation Gala, both smiling politely while the sapphire ring caught the light. Some articles praised the mysterious woman who had challenged industry experts with quiet confidence. Others questioned how an unknown landscape designer had suddenly become engaged to one of the country's most influential billionaires. Evelyn tried not to read them, but they found her anyway. Her phone filled with messages from former classmates, distant relatives, and people she had not spoken to in years. Some congratulated her. Others hinted that she had somehow won a lottery disguised as love. By mid-morning, she turned the phone off completely and walked into the garden behind the farmhouse. Pulling weeds had always been easier than untangling opinions. The familiar smell of fresh soil steadied her thoughts until a black SUV rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. Callan stepped out alone. He found her kneeling beside the tomatoes with dirt on her hands and sunlight falling through the branches above. "I had a feeling this is where you would be," he said. She smiled faintly without standing. "The internet cannot reach me very well out here." He glanced toward the rows of vegetables. "Lucky garden." For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "Do you ever get used to strangers deciding who you are?" Callan looked across the property before answering. "No. You simply stop expecting them to know the whole story." She brushed loose soil from her gloves. "Some people think I planned all of this. Does that bother you?" She nodded honestly. "More than I expected." Callan sat on the old wooden bench Thomas Mercer had built years before. "When my company first succeeded, people said I had been lucky. Then they said I had been ruthless. Later they said I inherited everything." He smiled quietly. "None of them were there for the years when failure was the only thing I seemed to own." Evelyn looked toward him. "How do you ignore it?" "I do not." He reached down and picked up a small gardening trowel resting beside the bench. "I simply decide whose opinion has earned the right to matter." His words settled gently into the morning air. Before Evelyn could answer, her phone vibrated inside her jacket pocket. She almost ignored it before noticing her mother's name. "Mom." A worried voice answered immediately. "Honey, do not panic, but there are reporters parked outside the front gate. They have been asking neighbors questions." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "I will be right there." Within minutes, they reached the front porch where two television vans waited across the road. Cameramen stood near the entrance while several reporters politely called Evelyn's name, hoping for a statement. Callan remained calm. "You do not have to say anything." She looked toward the reporters. "They are only doing their jobs." Before either of them moved, another vehicle arrived unexpectedly. Brandon stepped out looking noticeably less confident than the man who had once expected an effortless engagement. He approached slowly, stopping several feet from Evelyn. "Can we talk?" She nodded. Callan quietly stepped back toward the porch, giving them privacy without leaving entirely. Brandon lowered his eyes. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "I spent so much time planning our future that I never asked whether it was the future you actually wanted." He managed a small, embarrassed smile. "I thought success meant convincing people to agree with me." Evelyn answered gently. "Success means building something people want to belong to." Brandon laughed softly. "That sounds like something your father would have said." "It does." He looked briefly toward Callan before returning his attention to Evelyn. "For what it is worth, I hope you find whatever it was you were searching for." "Thank you." They shook hands warmly, not as former fiancés burdened by resentment, but as two people finally honest enough to wish each other well. Brandon walked away just as one reporter called out loudly from beyond the gate. "Miss Mercer, is your engagement real, or is this only a business arrangement?" The question hung in the air. Several cameras immediately turned toward her. Evelyn looked instinctively toward Callan. Their eyes met for only a second, but something unexpected passed between them. During the past week, they had shared meetings, conversations, long drives, and quiet moments beneath open skies. Somewhere along the way, pretending had become more complicated than either of them had anticipated. She stepped toward the gate with calm confidence. "Some parts of life deserve privacy," she answered kindly. "But I can tell you one thing. Every decision I have made this week has been honest." It was a careful answer, truthful without revealing more than necessary. The reporters accepted it, But as they slowly packed their equipment, another pair of eyes had already reached a very different conclusion. From inside a parked sedan across the street, Vanessa Ellington lowered the tablet resting in her lap. On its screen was a confidential legal document she had quietly obtained through one of the company's outside advisors. Across the top of the page appeared a title that made her expression slowly harden. Confidential Relationship Agreement. She stared at the words for several long moments before whispering to herself, "So that is the secret." And for the first time since Callan's helicopter had landed in the Mercer family garden, the carefully balanced promise between two honest people stood on the edge of becoming the very scandal they had both hoped to avoid. The following Monday began beneath heavy gray clouds that seemed to mirror the tension inside Whitmore Dynamics headquarters. By 8 o'clock, financial reporters crowded the lobby while television screens throughout the building displayed identical breaking news banners. Someone had leaked portions of the confidential relationship agreement. Although the document was incomplete and missing several pages, it was enough to ignite endless speculation. Headlines questioned whether the company's newest public engagement had been carefully staged to satisfy investors. Social media filled with opinions from people who had never met either Callan or Evelyn. Some accused them of deception. Others defended them without knowing the facts. Inside the executive conference room, board members argued in measured but unmistakably anxious voices. Several worried that public trust would decline. Others feared investors would delay major commitments. Callan listened quietly until everyone had finished speaking. Then he rose from his chair. "No one in this room will blame Miss Mercer for a document she did not create, authorize, or leak." His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "If there are questions, they belong to me." Across town, Evelyn had already seen the headlines before Callan could call. She sat at the old kitchen table holding her father's letter in one hand while the television quietly repeated the same story again and again. Her mother placed a warm cup of coffee beside her. "People can be very loud when they do not know the truth," she said gently. Evelyn smiled sadly. "The truth is complicated this time." Before her mother could answer, a familiar vehicle stopped outside the farmhouse. Callan stepped onto the porch carrying no briefcase, no security team, and no prepared speech. He simply looked tired. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Callan looked down. "I am sorry." She frowned. "You did not leak it." "No, neither did I." "I know." He exhaled slowly. "But I brought you into this world. I should have protected you better." Evelyn invited him inside. They sat across from one another at the same kitchen table where she had first read her father's letter only days earlier. Sunlight filtered through the old curtains, touching the weathered leather envelope resting between them. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Callan answered honestly. "The board wants me to announce that our engagement has ended." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment. They had always known the arrangement would eventually end. Hearing those words now felt unexpectedly painful. "Would that solve everything?" she asked. He shook his head. "It would solve the headlines." Silence settled between them. Evelyn looked toward the vegetable garden outside the window where new green shoots had begun pushing through the soil. "You once told me to decide whose opinion had earned the right to matter." Callan smiled faintly. "I did." She met his eyes. "Has the board earned that right?" He looked at her for a long moment before quietly answering, "No." Her next question came even more softly. "Have I?" Callan did not answer immediately because, for the first time in years, honesty required more courage than strategy. "Yes," he admitted, "more than anyone expected." Before either of them could continue, his phone vibrated repeatedly. He glanced at the screen before placing it face down on the table. "The board has called an emergency press conference this afternoon." Evelyn understood immediately. "They expect you to announce our separation." "Yes." She stood and walked toward the garden door, looking across the property her father had loved. "Then let them wait." Callan looked up, surprised. She turned back toward him with quiet determination. "There is somewhere we need to go first." 2 hours later, instead of driving toward corporate headquarters, they stood together at the entrance to Mercer Valley, the untouched property that had inspired everything. Volunteers, local farmers, conservation teachers, and neighboring families had gathered after hearing that restoration work might finally begin. They knew nothing about leaked contracts or boardroom politics. They only knew that this forgotten valley might soon become something meaningful again. Evelyn walked among them, greeting people by name, listening to stories about the land, accepting homemade pies and hand-drawn maps from elderly residents who remembered where old springs once flowed. Callan watched quietly as children pointed toward towering oak trees their grandparents had planted decades earlier. Nobody asked about stock prices. Nobody cared about media rumors. They cared about clean water, healthy forests, and leaving something better behind. An elderly woman approached Callan carrying a faded photograph. "Your father visited here once," she said with a warm smile. "Thomas Mercer brought him. They promised this valley would never become another shopping center." She placed the photograph into his hands before walking away. Callan stared at the image. Two younger men stood smiling beside the very same oak tree now stretching above the gathering. On the back, written in Thomas Mercer's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 simple words. "Promises grow stronger when good people keep planting together." Callan slowly looked toward Evelyn. She was kneeling beside a little boy, showing him how to press native wildflower seeds into the earth with gentle hands. In that quiet moment, surrounded by ordinary people doing ordinary acts of hope, he realized something that no contract had ever anticipated. Somewhere between a helicopter landing in a family garden and this peaceful valley waiting to bloom again, the agreement had quietly disappeared, leaving behind feelings that no signature could explain and no public announcement could erase. 3 days later, every major news network expected Callan Whitmore to appear before the cameras and announce the end of his engagement. Reporters filled the auditorium inside Whitmore Dynamics headquarters while investors, employees, and nonprofit partners quietly took their seats. Television producers counted down the final seconds before the live broadcast. Vanessa Ellington sat near the front, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had believed exposing the agreement would force the truth into the open. Instead, something unexpected had happened. Public support for Mercer Valley had grown stronger than ever. Thousands of volunteers had signed up to help restore the land after seeing photographs of local families planting trees together. The story people cared about was no longer whether an engagement had begun as a business arrangement. It had become the promise 2 families were finally keeping after more than 2 decades. Backstage, Callan adjusted his tie while reading Thomas Mercer's letter one final time. The paper had grown softer from being unfolded so many times during the past week. The final sentence now meant more than ever. Character is measured by the promises you keep after nobody expects you to keep them anymore. He carefully folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he walked onto the stage alone. Camera flashes immediately illuminated the room. A moderator welcomed everyone before stepping aside. Callan stood behind the podium for several quiet seconds, allowing the room to settle. "Many of you came here expecting a corporate announcement," he began calmly. "Instead, I owe you something much simpler. The truth." Every reporter leaned forward. "Several days ago, confidential documents were leaked suggesting that my engagement to Evelyn Mercer began as a formal agreement. That information is partially correct." Murmurs spread across the room. Callan continued without hesitation. "The agreement existed because I believed responsibility could be managed the same way I managed business. I believed every challenge could be solved through planning." He smiled gently. "I was wrong." The room became completely silent. During the past several weeks, I watched someone choose honesty over convenience, kindness over recognition, and service over attention. Evelyn Mercer reminded me that leadership begins by listening, not by controlling. She honored a promise made by her father long before she ever met me. Somewhere along the way, the agreement stopped meaning anything at all. At that exact moment, the rear doors of the auditorium quietly opened. Evelyn entered wearing the same simple elegance that had defined her from the beginning. She had not come dressed for headlines. She had come carrying the weathered leather envelope that had changed both of their lives. Every camera turned toward her as she slowly walked down the center aisle. Callan stepped away from the podium to meet her. Neither of them spoke until they stood together beneath the stage lights. Evelyn looked into his eyes with the same calm courage she had shown the day she ended her first engagement. Without saying a word, she carefully removed the sapphire ring from her finger and placed it in Callan's hand. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Then she smiled warmly. "This ring should never belong to a contract." Callan looked down at the sapphire for a long moment before gently closing his fingers around it. Then, instead of placing it into his pocket, he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The entire auditorium froze. Looking up at Evelyn, his voice remained steady, but every word came straight from his heart. The first time I offered you this ring, I was asking for your help. Today I am asking for your future. No agreements. No conditions. No deadlines. Only the chance to spend my life planting something beautiful beside the woman who taught me what real wealth actually looks like. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as soft laughter escaped through her smile. You finally asked the right question. Is that a yes? She nodded. Yes. This time it is completely real. As he placed the sapphire ring back onto her finger, the room erupted into applause. Even Vanessa found herself smiling before joining everyone else. Later, she quietly approached Evelyn and offered a sincere apology for allowing suspicion to outweigh understanding. Evelyn accepted it without hesitation, proving once again that grace often changed hearts more effectively than victory ever could. 1 year later, Mercer Valley welcomed its first visitors. Wildflower meadows stretched across hillsides once forgotten. Children explored nature trails beside grandparents who remembered the land from decades earlier. Community gardens overflowed with vegetables donated to local food banks. Near the entrance stood a simple bronze plaque dedicated to Thomas Mercer and Richard Whitmore. Beneath their names appeared a single sentence, chosen by Evelyn and Callan together. The greatest inheritance is not wealth. It is a promise faithfully kept. That same afternoon, family and friends gathered beneath the old oak tree in the Mercer family garden where everything had quietly begun. There were no television cameras, no investors, and no business speeches. Only laughter, fresh flowers, homemade food, and people who genuinely loved them. As the evening sun settled across the garden, a helicopter passed high overhead on its way somewhere else, its distant sound drifting gently across the hills before disappearing into the quiet. Evelyn smiled at Callan and slipped her hand into his. Neither of them looked toward the sky. They had already found exactly where they belonged. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.